Three, two, one, and we are live. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Nadya's Entrepreneurial Corner. I'm really excited to be back in my virtual studio doing this podcast. For those of you who are not aware, I was actually taking a little bit of a break, a lot going on. And in many ways, over the last year, I have been running to my own monsters metaphorically. So I'm really excited to have the founder and CEO of an organization called Run to the Monster, literally, Roy Gluckman, in my virtual studio today, all the way from across the pond in Europe. Roy, welcome to Nadya's Entrepreneurial Corner. Thank you for being here.
Such a pleasure. Even further than across the pond and all the way across another whole continent, actually calling from Cape Town, South Africa.
Oh my gosh. Okay. For some reason, I thought you were like in the UK, but yeah, you're even farther away. What time is it for you right now, Roy?
It's about the same time there. So we are at 9 p.m.
Okay. No, I think you're actually an hour ahead. I'm pretty sure the UK is 8 p.m. So yeah, so 9 hours
Yes,
ahead.
British summertime is a bit, yes, exactly.
Well, thanks for bearing with me and
Such a
getting
pleasure.
on the show. And it's noon
Very
here in Las Vegas. So Roy, Run to the Monster, what a name. Tell me a little bit about you and how this like organization came into fruition with this amazing name.
Thank you. So Run to the Monster is essentially an organization that creates content, training content, video training content around and within the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space, right? So that's what we do. And I've been in the DEI space now for over a decade. And if I kind of think about why I'm in this work, right? And it's quite a novelty for there to be a white South African man doing diversity and inclusion work. And particularly at the time, this is like 13 years ago, when we didn't have the language of like psychological safety. We were talking about diversity training, right? And I've kind of watched diversity training become diversity and inclusion, become diversity, equity, and inclusion, now belonging, now, so I've really seen the evolution. But still kind of like as a white man doing this work, kind of came about through my own experience of the power of education that relates to this, right? So I studied law, and part of the course was a program called Constitutional Law and Human Rights, really looking at the South African Constitution, which is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And it was an incredibly challenging experience for me, right? Because I'm in this incredibly inspiring lecture, reading this amazing case law, which is really just storytelling packaged in a more formal way. And I'm having real realizations and real emotional moments where I'm listening to the idea of equity and equality. And I'm like, that sounds amazing. It's redress. It's about redistribution. It's about understanding our history. But then also growing up as a white man, being told that there's now no opportunities for me in this country because we have affirmative action legislation, and me being told that I'm the wrong race and the wrong jet. So it was this real tug of war in that I'm hearing something compelling, but I also don't believe it. And it was this real opportunity for me to run to my monsters. That's what this was. I was confronted with my stuff, my beliefs, my inherited beliefs, the narratives that I'd digested from my family, people around me. And that was a turning point for my life. It's why I do this work. It was kind of a calling, or I felt compelled to create similar spaces for other people, right? For other people to run to their monsters, the things that scare them. And when we think about organizations, which is where we do the majority of our work, within organizations, within culture, are the culture monsters, right? The things we don't want to talk about, who belongs, who feels like they're automatically seen as leadership, who's put in front of clients. And really what we say as a call to action is, let's look at these things that scare us, the narratives, the beliefs.
Let's go back to when you were thinking about those monsters that you needed to face, because for those of you guys listening who don't know, there's a lot going on and has been going on for years and years and years in South Africa with respect to race and racial segregation. Would you mind just taking a few moments just to kind of educate or reorient the audience on some of these challenges and how that impacted you with respect to your monsters?
Totally. So of course, South Africa, in our lifetime, has swung from being one of the most systemically exclusive, exclusionary, racist, and violent regimes in the world, being the apartheid government, which prioritized systematically whiteness, right? So it privileged whiteness in a systemic, legal, economic, political sense in every which way. And at the time was a white, or still is a white minority, right? So through violence, both physical and psychological, kind of created this us and the them. We then have an incredibly long and violent transition, right, of resistance and freedom fighting. And then in 1994, we have our first democratic election where we have a black government, essentially, which was the liberation movement at the time, become the first democratically elected government in South Africa. And what's really interesting is that overnight, we move from an oppressive regime to one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, right? Because part of our liberation movement was about freedom, equality, human dignity. These are the fundamental tenets, and they form part of our democracy today. So part of that idea of equality was really thinking about redress. And part of redress was, how do we create affirmative action legislation to provide and deliberately provide access to resources and opportunities for what we would call previously disadvantaged groups, which is Black and Brown South Africans. So I've existed in a world where there was, I mean, I was very young during apartheid South Africa, into this progressive constitution. But I think what's really interesting is that just because we change with an election doesn't mean that, like, my parents changed and our ideology changed.
Right.
So a lot of people get left behind, right? So part of the fear that was part of my family narrative was, as mentioned, Roy, you're the wrong race and you're the wrong gender. All the opportunities are now not for you. You need to leave. This isn't your home. And you can imagine what that does for a young, ambitious man. It's like, well, I need to get out. This isn't my home. And part of that panic has been or relieving part of that panic has been a lot of the healing work that I've had to do through this work of diversity and inclusion. Like, I do have a place. It looks different to what I thought. My voice is different to what I thought it needed to be. But here I am, right? This is purpose work.
I'm curious, just to dig a little bit deeper, like what, as all of this is happening and you were growing up, what were your parents' belief systems and how did that kind of contribute to monsters that you had around your identity amongst all of the chaos?
Beautiful. I mean, I think much like most upper middle class parents, it was a conservative upbringing, right? In every respect. It was a very heterosexual, normative relationship. My parents didn't really have any queer friends. Working dads, stay-at-home moms, religious in a certain degree, if not devout, adjacent. And then, of course, is the racialized ideology of what South Africa was all about, right? So my parents grew up in apartheid South Africa there most of their lives. The propaganda, not only about superiority and of entitlement, but also of inferiority of people of color, right? Of fear. They're to be feared, hence why we put them away and we keep them out. They are dangerous. That's why we let them in conditionally. They are there in service of our needs. And then all of a sudden, that changes. And now all of a sudden, we're meant to kind of coexist. So social cohesion is a fundamental struggle and goal of the South African nation. And I think in many respects, a case study to the rest of the world. But these beliefs around not only superiority, but also fear of the other, and scarcity. There is not enough. When I think about the image of monsters, because monsters are not real, right, Nadya? We know this. They're not real, but they don't need to be real to have a real impact on us, right? The boogeyman, the shadow that crosses, we kind of see it and then we turn and then we don't see it, but we can kind of sense it, we can feel it. And just that is enough to shift our behavior. So when I think about my upbringing, I always use this kind of like imagery of sitting on our parents' bed, and this isn't a real thing that happened, but it's like a feeling, and we kind of pull the blankets over us, all of us, and we're like, don't look outside. Outside is scary. Don't look. Let's keep here. Here we are safe, and that shelteredness is so much about what privilege is. And looking out is scary because we don't know what's there. And part of kind of peeling away that comforter, that duvet, that blanket, and kind of looking is what my work is about. I think it's what the word woke is intended to mean, not what it's become. It's about being awake to what is out there and figuring it out for yourself. And in that is a liberation, is a freedom in itself, which is essentially why we do this work.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Really well put. And I think,
Mm,
monsters and just a monster as an idea, it's so much about
mm,
perception, right? It's like I mentioned
mm,
earlier in the episode that over the last year, I've been kind of running to my monsters, things that I have
mm.
just been inadvertently viewing as scary or problematic and maybe
Beautiful.
procrastinating with dealing with. Right. And so,
Yeah.
there's just so many layers to this idea
Right.
of running to the monster. So just to
Totally.
now fast forward a little bit more into the future. So you went to school for law and you're
Mhm,
hearing, you can't stay here. There's no opportunity. So what
mhm.
happened next? I really want to get to how did you kind of maneuver into the DEI space from there?
Yeah. So I'm in this law class. I'm 23 years old, and I have a full blown identity crisis, right? A full blown identity crisis because I'm like, hold on a second. I'm hearing this really compelling narrative, academic, case law, inspiring kind of ideological framing of what the world is and what it can be in the form of human rights and constitutionalism. But I'm like feeling really scared because I've been told that all of that is bad for me. But
Mhm.
it feels so kind of this tug of war created this fracture. I broke essentially. There was a full blown identity crisis. And kind of part of what emerged from that identity crisis was whose beliefs were these? When
Yeah.
did I believe this? When did I decide that these were my beliefs? And I was like, I never really had the opportunity. Why didn't I have the opportunity? I went to some of the best schools in the country. They didn't provide me that. Why didn't they? And it was kind of like it presents. It's like, oh, I need to create that opportunity. So in a very informal way, I just kind of emailed the schools around my university campus and I was like, listen, I want to talk about constitutional law and human rights. And they're like, yeah, come speak to our learners, come speak to our students. So we just have these very informal conversations. It became a huge passion of mine. I finished up my law degree, went into practice, and I kind of started to see very similar narratives emerge within the corporate space. And I was like, you guys also feel like there's now no opportunity for you, even though we exist in this incredibly fancy law firm. You guys think the same way that those students, and kind of like everything started to, there's a systemic belief. There's this actually a way of being in this country that needs to be critically thought about because it's getting in the way of this nation building social cohesion project. So I just continued to do this work on the side. I'd do a talk here, do a talk there. And then the talks became, can you do a workshop? And I was like, yeah. And that became a consulting firm and a training firm. And Run to the Monster is the next iteration of all of that, which really looks at
How many
how,
years per passed
yeah.
between
Mm,
then, like when you started,
mm,
and where you are now with the inception of this new exciting entity?
yeah. It's been about 12 years.
Okay.
And I think what's been really fascinating from this 12-year experience is seeing the conversation of diversity and inclusion grow, right? So again, starting just when it was called diversity training, and then it was like, oh, actually it's inclusion, oh, it's equality. And then even coming now, I mean, obviously then going through COVID, which fundamentally changed the learning landscape within organizations. And now coming into this really weird time of the global war or the war on DEI happening in places like the States and the global North. So I've kind of got to experience over this decade and a bit the kind of growth, the gold rush, the shrink of this category, which is still so misunderstood and so deeply important.
Let's talk a little bit about the, as you put it, the war on DEI, because, being here in the States and, knowing people who work in the space, but also, having friends who, might not agree fully with, DEI practices, but then on the opposite end of the train, people who are very involved. I tend to think very independently. And I think, what can happen, unfortunately, is that there are bad actors and there is, what I call tokenization of, people, unfortunately. So it's less about like equity and diversity. It's more about like, how can we kind of handpick people that fit these archetypes, these kind of self-imposed identity archetypes, and place them in roles, and then it doesn't really feel authentic anymore. So what do you attribute to the war on DEI? Do you think it is some of that, those bad actors?
I mean, how much time, how long do you want your listeners to be on this podcast for?
I think we have another 15 minutes.
I'm going to try and summarize. And excuse me to kind of make this quite reductive, but this is incredibly complex as a question. So I'm going to try and
I know. My questions get intense. So there you go.
I love questions and I love intense questions. So don't stress. Firstly, the war on DEI is also an ideological one, right? There are some people who, and again, ideology is never, I'm going to say this again, ideology is never about right or wrong or good or bad. It is always about our emotions: fear, anger, scarcity. What will my children have? It's not about what's right or good, or it's not. It's about our emotions, right? So there's an ideological issue with DEI as one of the big kind of drivers of the war against DEI. So we think when we say it's an ideological issue, we think that we sit in different poles in our implementation, or should we have it? No, it's actually, we're not, we're actually emotional. We're frightened, we're scared. You're taking away my things. My children won't have the same opportunities. So we resist, we defend, we protect what is ours. Very natural. It's what my dad did to me. My dad was telling me to leave South Africa, not because he hates South Africa, but because he loves me. He was worried about me. He's like, you're not going to grow up in the country that I grew up in. You're not going to have the opportunities. And that's frightening for me. So I'm going to tell you something to save you in his way.
Right.
And that's a lot what we're seeing, right? So there's this ideological resistance to it. And there's a space to talk about the ideological differences, right? Let's talk about our fears. Let's talk about our emotions. Let's talk about our monsters. This is the work I do, is thinking about our emotions. Then there's the kind of practical critique, which is, this isn't really changing anything. We're spending a lot of money and it's not really, we're not seeing the impact. And I think that that's a fair critique. I do think it's a fair critique in part, but it's also sometimes that critique gets co-opted by the ideological differences as now, like, I don't have to be seen as ideologically being against this. I can say it's not actually having the impact and that's why I don't like it. I don't. So while I think that there's some critique on the process and have we achieved anything and is it good money spent, I think that there is some validity in that argument. And for me as a provider and a practitioner, I'm looking at that and saying, well, what impact can we have? What are we trying to do? How do we make this work, right? So I want to take that on as a practitioner. But then there's also just a deep misunderstanding of change and how change works and how complex change is, not only for me as an individual, but for a system, for a nation. It's incredibly complex. So to expect that all of a sudden, if we now do a big D&I training rollout in our organization, and now we're inclusive, that's such poor form anyway. Like, you could never have expected that to work. So we've almost inflated our expectations, and then we haven't met them, and we're like, see, it's not working. And I'm just trying to reestablish what it is we can do, how complex change is, why this is still important, taking these things into account and holding the space for the ideological differences, right? So, I mean, like that's like balancing
Yeah.
multiple plates.
Yeah. What do you say when you run into someone who's like, well, I mean, I'm just going to do the right thing and I'm just going to hire diverse, and that includes diverse points of view.
Mm.
Why do I need to go through this training? It feels performative. Have you run into that? Because it certainly is a theme of resistance here in the US.
I think the idea, I mean, the equivalent that I've heard is like, I'm just going to hire the best person for the job, right? Or kind of the idea of diversity of thought is good enough as being part of diversity. I think, Nadia, what is at the root maybe of what the complaint is our anxiety or our fear or our frustration with identity. Like,
Mhm.
I don't want to think about identity or race, gender, sexual orientation, physical disability. I just want to hire the best person for the job. Or why do we have to bring this identity thing in? Surely we just show up at work, we do our best work, we get it done, cool, we go home. Like, why does our stuff? And that is a fundamental misunderstanding, not only of the human experience, but also how it is workplaces are formed and how it is we show up within workplaces.
Mm.
So while I think that, yes, we all just want to hire the best people for the job, and yes, diversity of thought is important, I think diversity and inclusion training is important because it actually aims, at least the work that I do, to remind us that our identity is fundamental, not only to how we perform, but also the trust that other people give us to perform. So while I absolutely want to hire the best person for the job, if I've been taught or I have caught who is automatically going to be best, that's absolutely going to influence the decision making in
Yeah,
this, right? It's absolutely going to. So our idea of the best candidate is deeply subjective. Diversity of thought, of course, is important, but cannot be a scapegoat to a history of oppression against different identities, right? We need to account
right.
for this. It's about redistribution and equity. This is what we're doing.
Right. No, that's fantastic. So well
Mm.
put. And I think it is really like a holistic thing. And I think that, when you frame it that way, so much of the monster that we're running to is, the leadership's own issues with their own identities and their relationships with other people's identities.
Yeah,
So it's that intersection that either
totally.
they fear or they just don't even want to think about, the intersection.
Totally. Because if we say we need to think about identity, what we're saying is we need to think about how we're different. And if we have to think about how we're different, we have to think about why those differences matter. And if we think about why those differences matter, we have to think about our history. And now I can be seen as a bad person. Oh, what am I going to do with my shame and my guilt? Oh, I don't like that. Let's not talk about our identity. Similarly, we also have people of color, queer people, women who also like, I don't want to talk about our identity because I also don't want to be seen as the eternal victim, as needing a handout, right? So
Right.
again, it's a guilt and a shame response. They're the same thing. We're feeling the same thing. So for
Yeah.
me, it's like, how do we just talk about shame and
Right.
pain and fear and anger? And yes, hope and joy and cohesion and unity. Um, that's the conversations that I think we're missing. But very often we don't want to talk about our emotions. We just want to get the job done. And it's like, well, emotions are going to help you or get in the way. So,
Always there too. They
always.
permeate everything. You can have quote unquote neutrality of emotion, but even that neutrality in and of itself is a form of emotion.
Yeah.
So, I think
Yeah.
people, they just want to ignore that, and it's crazy, being someone who has global hires. I've had team members
Mm,
in West Africa and South Africa and the
mm,
Philippines and Canada, the
mm.
US, everywhere. And there are so many cultural nuances that I've had to educate myself on, just as
Sure.
my team members have had to educate themselves on the cultural nuances, of how we do business, quote unquote,
Mm,
here in the US. We're constantly kind of learning back and forth from one another. So what I'm curious now, because there's just such a meta conversation to the name
Mm,
of your business.
mm,
It's so fascinating to me. So when we were first chatting, I was like, I feel like there is just such a meta piece to this as you were building Run to the Monster to help others, primarily in leadership and corporate face their monsters, individual and collective, cultural, all
mhm,
the things. How are you running to your monsters, and what were those
mm.
monsters for you?
I mean, if there's one thing I've learned about entrepreneurship, is that it is a deeply psychological experience, right? It is such a psychological experience being an entrepreneur. The monsters that I've had to face, I mean, firstly, kind of the reason I do this work, as mentioned, is that original kind of confrontation with my monsters, my inherited beliefs. And of course, that continues, right? It's like, who am I as a white man to do this work? And that's a monster I have to run to every single day. Every single time I get in front of people, I'm looking at them, looking at me, saying, what does this white boy know about being different?
Right.
And that's something that I have to own every single day, right? My queerness is there-ish, but
Mhm,
it's not what you're seeing immediately all the time. So
mhm,
that monster is something I have to run to literally every meeting I have, because there's a legitimacy component, right? They're like, oh, so you're getting this guy in to whitewash and sanitize the conversation. Wow. And I have to be like, well, so that's absolutely part of the running to the monster. Um, Running to the monster, or run to the monster, is also part of our organization's culture mantra, right? We use it all the time. I mean, we used it just today. I mean, it's literally something we do. It's like, let's go do the thing that scares us, right? Let's do this thing that absolutely scares us, that we actually don't want to do. We're like, okay, we're running to the monster on this. And there's something so I mean, I don't want to say inspiring, because it's not always inspiring to run to the monsters, but affirming. It's like, okay, we're looking at the scary thing, it's probably right to do that, let's go. Because that is, at the
mhm.
end of the day, what this is all about, right? It's the things we don't want to look at that we should be looking at. So just like how it is we engage and call in whiteness and white men, right? It's scary for me to like call out my dad, but like, how do we create programs that say, come listen to us, right? That's such a monster that we have to consistently run to. Negative feedback that we get, fears of division. These are things that we have to constantly say, okay, we're listening. Let's go.
I love that.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, so much of your dad's belief systems were, they were indoctrinated. Like that's all he had in terms of his exposure. And
That's
so,
it.
when it just really comes down to education, like a lot of
Mm.
people, I always like to say people don't know what they don't know,
Of course.
but they know what they've been handed. And so, it's kind of just you have to be patient. And I do think, here in the States, it's part of the challenge when you see
Mm.
so much extremism here and really throughout the world, but here in
Mm.
the US, especially, it's like, one side is very hard lined on these views, the
Mm.
other side is so hard lined on these views. And
Mm.
I don't know how much you know about the state of Nevada, but that's
Mm.
where I'm based. I'm based in Las Vegas, Nevada, and here, it's considered a purple state because there's a lot of
Mm.
intersection between Republicans and Democrats because the focus is really on facilitating change and making a
Mm.
difference and not
Mm.
being so fixated on politics or political divide, and that's
Yeah.
why I feel like it's such a great place to be, and I hope,
Right.
we can be more like that throughout the world.
Mm.
I know that's what you're really, striving
Mm.
for with your work to get people to face those challenges head on
Absolutely.
in a way that's
Absolutely.
egalitarian and
Mm.
wonderful. I love that. So, as a call to action, as we near the end of this episode, what do you recommend to people in terms of how they can face their fears, how to run to their monsters? It is the month of Halloween. It is
Mm.
October. I mean, I love Halloween, but let's, really get this in terms of like a metaphor or allegory. What do you advocate for them to do? How should they do it?
I think the idea of monsters are there to distract us from looking at the things that matter, right? So either it's internally, our stuff, or within our business, right? The stuff that we don't want to look at that is maybe not going right or is just hard, right? So monsters are there to kind of like distract us from not looking at those things and running to the monsters. Okay, come, we're going. We're staring at it. We're going down that road.
Yeah.
I think for me, and I said this kind of passing, that entrepreneurship is such a psychological experience, right? It brings up so much of your stuff. It is so exposing, not only of like your deep ambitions, but also of like your pain and your need for status, your need for autonomy. Like there's so much wrapped in it. It's like a resistance. It's everything. And I think when I think about what leaders of the future look like, or an inclusive leader, or how it is we build organizations that promote healing, and for me this is really the work that I do, is how do we create organizations that allow people to heal? And we heal by letting go of our biases and finding our voice and ridding ourselves of imposter syndrome and finding our value, and letting go of our prejudice, right? That moment for me when I'm like, oh wow, that identity fracture, and then you come to and you say, well, who am I? Is a healing moment, and I believe that can happen within organizations when we have organizations and leaders who understand trauma, who understand the psychological nature of our history and identity. So I guess for me, how we run to our monsters is facing the kind of psychological fracture that exists along identity lines, and how our history of favoring some identities over the other fundamentally changes how it is we show up in this world. So, I mean, that I was thinking about, like, what is the advice to entrepreneurs? What is the advice to leaders? Is always, how do we start building a deeper understanding of the psychological need to belong? Because when we can understand that for ourselves, right, in our own entrepreneurship journeys, when we can create that within our own teams, that is such an incredible unlock. It really is, not only of innovation and all those wonderful things that diversity bring, but actually of healing and connection, and of just like having a good day at the office and doing good work. And at the end of the day, Nadya, this is so I say this like 100 times a day. At the end of the day, all people really want is to show up, work, do their best work, build a career, and not leave totally slammed and broken. And as entrepreneurs, we have the power to do that within our spaces. And I think the key to do that is to understand and to run to the monsters of identity and our history and trauma and pain, and bring it into the workday. Bring it in. Let's understand how this influences how we show up. I think belonging is such an incredible unlock for us.
Authenticity, guys. It really
Yeah.
starts there. You know, you gotta own your shit. And that
Yeah.
is
You got to own your
a
shit.
huge part of running to the monster. Roy, thank you so much for
Such a
being
pleasure.
here. Where can everybody find you on
Mm.
social media and online?
So you can visit runtothemonster.com, or feel free to visit my personal website, which is roygluckman.com. And on our website, runtothemonster.com, you'll see all the links and also references and some free videos to see some of the documentary style training we're creating for organizations, which is, it's just having the most incredible impact with people. People are just amazed to see how we can create like this incredible Netflix for work experience, and I'm learning, but it's actually for my organizations. It's like a wonderful moment, where we can kind of run to our monsters together in a way which feels a bit safe and engaging and even a little bit entertaining, which is kind of what we're here for at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for
Such a
sharing
pleasure.
all the great insight. And guys, again, run to the monster. Thanks.
Run.
Thanks for being here. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.